Hello, my name is Dr. Matthew Gray, and I'm a professor of ancient scripture at Brigham University. I'm excited to join you today in this virtual Education Week course, sharing some scriptural and historical insights into a topic that has long been fascinating to me, and that is the relationship between Jesus, as presented in the New Testament Gospels, this title, the Son of Man, and Messianic expectations that circulated within Judaism during the time of the New Testament. This is a topic that is fascinating to anybody who has spent time reading the New Testament Gospels. If you spend time in either the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, or in the Gospel of John, you may have noticed that the title that Jesus most often uses for himself is this strange and enigmatic title of Son of Man, or in Greek, huios tou anthropou. This is a topic or a title that Jesus uses over 69 times for himself in the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and over 13 times for himself in the Gospel of John. However, for many modern readers of the New Testament, this title seems a little bit odd, because after all, isn't Jesus supposed to be the Son of God? Why would he refer to himself as the Son of Man? Well, I believe that the answer to that question comes from how that phrase, Son of Man, developed going all the way back from the Old Testament period and continued to evolve in Jewish usage into the first century time of Jesus. So in this class, what I want to do is explore the history of this title, Son of Man, starting with Old Testament writings. We'll see how that title, Son of Man, comes to be used as a messianic title among some Jewish groups in the first century who are looking forward to a time or an era of messianic redemption. And then we will see how Jesus uses that title in reference to himself, seemingly to connect himself with this messianic concept that we will find from the Old Testament. So to begin, I want to start by looking at how the phrase Son of Man is most often used in the Old Testament. So the phrase Son of Man can be seen in both Hebrew and Aramaic variations throughout Old Testament writings. Most often in the Old Testament, we will see the Hebrew phrase Ben Adam, which literally means a son of Adam, or a human being. And the Aramaic correspondence to that is the Bar Enosh, which actually means the same thing. So most often in the Old Testament, the phrase Son of Man, Ben Adam, or Bar Enosh, simply refers to a human being or a mortal of some kind. So for example, the phrase Ben Adam literally means a son of Adam or a son of a human. And so if we read through Old Testament texts, we will see that most often that is how it is used. And so let me give you a few examples very quickly, starting with Psalm 8. So in this psalm, we see both variations, Ben Adam and Enosh, being used in reference to humanity broadly. Here's the Psalm 8, verses 3 through 6. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are humans, Enosh, that you are mindful of them? Or mortals, Ben Adam, or son of Adam, that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. So a really important example of how that phrase, Son of Man, simply refers to human beings or humanity in general. Similarly, Isaiah chapter 51, verse 12. I am he that comforts you. Why are you afraid of a mere mortal who must die, a human being, a Ben Adam, who fades like grass? So a son of man or a human being who fades like grass. And then finally, some of you might be familiar with the use of the phrase Son of Man in the visions of Ezekiel, where God refers to Ezekiel as a human being, setting up the relationship between God as a divine being versus Ezekiel as a mortal. So for example, often in the book of Ezekiel, when God gives Ezekiel a vision, he will sometimes begin by saying, listen to me, son of man, or mortal, Ben Adam. Can these bones live? And then there's a conversation between God and the prophet Ezekiel, referring to Ezekiel as the son of man, or a human being. So throughout the Old Testament, that is the most common use of this phrase, Son of Man. It just simply refers to a human, a son of Adam in some way, as opposed to God, who is a divine being. So where then do we get the connection between this phrase, Son of Man, as simply a human being, to the phrase Son of Man being a messianic title in the time of the New Testament? Well, to understand the link between that development, we have to understand the role of the phrase Son of Man in the apocalyptic vision of Daniel chapter 7. So let's go ahead and turn there now. First of all, what is an apocalyptic vision as it relates especially to Daniel 7? Well, apocalyptic literature is a genre of writings that exists in the Old Testament. It develops quite late in the Old Testament period, but that uses highly symbolic images to depict current political events, sufferings of God's people, but also uses these symbols to represent how God will intervene and ultimately save his people. And probably the most famous apocalyptic text of the Old Testament, the most famous version of one of these symbolic visions that carries that message of hope and ultimate divine deliverance, is going to be the chapter of Daniel 7. So let's take a quick look at that chapter, and I want to focus specifically on how this phrase Son of Man is used in this apocalyptic vision, so we can start getting a sense of how we go from using that phrase as just simply referring to a human being to an image of messianic deliverance. So here's the apocalyptic vision of Daniel 7. In the beginning of the vision, we see the prophet Daniel. He's in exile in Babylon, and he's sleeping, and he has a night vision. And this night vision, or this dream, opens up with a terrifying array of apocalyptic symbolism, starting with a chaotic ocean. And out of the ocean, one by one, we see these strange beasts, these strange creatures emerging from the sea, and Daniel becomes increasingly terrified as he sees these animals or these beasts emerging from the chaotic oceans. Here's what we read in Daniel 7. So in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Well, then he wrote down the dream and said, I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts coming up out of the sea, different one from another. And then he goes on to describe these individual beasts as they sequentially come out of the sea. The first one, Daniel says, was like a lion and had eagle wings, so kind of this fascinating composite creature of some kind. Then the second one looked like a bear, and it was raised up on one side. It had tusks in his mouth, really fascinating image among his teeth, and was told, arise and devour many bodies. And then the third beast kind of looked like a leopard. So you get this image that beast after beast is coming out of the ocean. Daniel is becoming increasingly frightened by what he's seeing. And then it is the fourth beast that is by far the most terrifying vision or part of the vision for Daniel. Here's how he describes this. He says, well, after this, I saw in the visions by night a fourth beast. It was terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping that which was left with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts because this beast had 10 horns coming out of his head. And it goes on to say, and as I was looking at those 10 horns, I noticed that another one, an 11th horn, a little horn, began to appear as well, right? And these horns, especially that 11th horn, had eyes like a human, and it's like it grew a mouth, and it started speaking blasphemies against God. And this is a pretty terrifying sight. And as the vision continues to develop, we'll notice that these beasts, especially this fourth beast, begins devouring God's people, persecuting the holy ones, terrifying and destroying the people of God. Well, as Daniel continues throughout this vision, at some point, of course, he just has to ask, what am I looking at? What is this strange image of these sequential beasts coming out of the ocean and this terrifying fourth beast who is devouring God's people? What am I to understand by this? Well, in the vision, Daniel eventually encounters an angel who can help interpret some of these images for him. And the interpretation that Daniel is given for these beasts is a bit vague, it's a bit general, but overall, it's pretty clear what these beasts are meant to represent. The angel tells him that these four beasts are meant to represent four kings or four kingdoms, right? Four human empires, four entities, political entities on the earth that arise and that one after another increasingly make war with the people of God, with the holy ones, with the saints. And what he notices is that the horns of the fourth beast represent 10 kings that exist among that fourth kingdom, right? That fourth political entity. And that fourth beast, especially with the 11th king that arises from within that kingdom, represents a political kingdom or political empire that is extremely ferocious and that does great damage to God's people on the earth. In fact, wearing out the holy ones of the Most High and even attempting to stamp out the laws of the people of God, stamping out the ritual calendar and the law. Well, sadly, that's all the angel gives us by way of interpretation. So while we generally know that these beasts are meant to represent kingdoms of this earth that persecute God's people, with that emphasis on that fourth final terrifying beast, sadly, the angel never does tell us exactly which kingdoms Daniel has in mind. This, of course, has led scholars to speculate for many, many generations and centuries over exactly which political and historical entities are these beasts meant to represent. So if you were to go online or look through various biblical commentaries, you're going to see various interpretations of what these beasts mean. Among those interpretations, the one that is most common among scholars of the Bible is the idea that each of these beasts probably represent kingdoms of Daniel's own time. And in particular, probably being that the first beast is Babylon, the second beast is Media, the third beast is Persia, and then the fourth beast is Greece. In that case, that fourth and final ferocious beast would be the beast that would persecute God's people the most. And one of the reasons why some scholars, or many scholars, think that this is such a compelling interpretation for the vision is because with the empire of Greece that arises after the Babylonian and Persian periods, it is in fact 10 kings after Alexander the Great that we get the Greek king that did offer most persecution to the Jewish community in Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 160s BC. So that arrangement of Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece, with Greece having 10 kings following Alexander the Great, and the 11th king being Antiochus IV Epiphanes as the little horn, the great persecutor of Jews, that leads of course, to the Maccabean revolt and the establishment of the festival of Hanukkah. Most scholars believe that that seems to fit most clearly with what Daniel has in mind and with the historical context of Daniel. At the end of the day, though, I do not want to be dogmatic about exactly what these beasts represent. There might be various interpretations that seem compelling to you, and that's fine. For the purposes of this course, I just wanted to highlight that these beasts clearly represent kingdoms of this earth that are persecuting God's people, and what's most important for this topic is how is that going to be resolved by God? And this leads to the phrase, Son of Man. So if we keep reading in the book of Daniel then, you get the sense that Daniel, it's like he cries out to God as he watches this fourth beast, whoever that kingdom might be, that fourth beast terrify God's people, devour God's people. It's like Daniel cries out to the Lord, when are you going to stop this? How are you going to intervene? Or when are you going to save your people? Or how are you going to save your people? And it's in the answer that we find the key to the topic we're discussing today. Here's how the vision continues. So as Daniel watches these beasts, he then looks up in his vision and he sees in the heavens thrones set in place. And he even sees God sitting on his throne. And in this particular text, God is referred to as the Ancient One, or the Ancient of Days in Hebrew, or it's Atik Yomin, actually in Aramaic. And so as he sees God sitting on his throne, he notices that God's clothing is white as snow, the hair of his head is like pure wool, and the throne was like fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. So even the throne room scene of God is highly symbolic and just fascinating in its imagery. And he sees a stream of fire issuing out and flowing out from God's presence as the Ancient of Days, the Atik Yomin, sits on the throne, and he sees 1,000 serving him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stand beside him, these angelic figures praising God at his throne. And then he sees the court sits in judgment, and the books of judgment are open. So in response to the question, how will God save his people from the beasts that are devouring them, these political entities that are tearing God's people apart? In response, Daniel sees God sitting on the throne, surrounded by angels, and then a judgment scene is open. And the highlight, the culmination of this judgment scene is where we get to our title, Son of Man. Because as the books of judgment are open, Daniel then notices in the night vision that he sees one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. And this is where we see our phrase, kavar anash, which is one like the Son of Man. But he's coming on the clouds. So it's like in response to Daniel's question, God on his throne, opening a judgment scene, will now send one like the Son of Man on the clouds of glory to not only destroy the beasts, to save God's people, but to open a judgment scene where the wicked, those who persecuted the holy ones, will be judged, and the righteous will be saved. Here is how Daniel goes on to describe that vision of the Son, or one like the Son of Man, a human figure, coming on the clouds to save God's people from God's throne room. Well, Daniel goes on to say that that Son of Man on the clouds came to the Ancient One. So he's standing now side by side with the Ancient of Days. He comes to God sitting on his throne. Although I will say, by the way, that this is a fascinating passage in the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, because there are two different textual traditions of this. In Greek, many of the translations or many of the texts will use the phrase Heos, which is, so the Son of Man came unto the Ancient of Days, right? So he's coming to God sitting on his throne. But some Greek texts actually drop out the E or the epsilon and have hos, which actually makes a significant difference, because if you drop out that E, as some textual traditions do, we now read that the Son of Man is coming as the Ancient of Days, as if the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days might in fact be one in some way. As you could probably imagine, that is going to have, that very small variation in the text is going to have a very significant impact on the way later Christians come to understand the divine nature of Jesus and so forth. But hold on to that thought for a moment. We'll come back to that later in the lecture. But for now, just note that in Daniel's vision, he sees the Son of Man on the clouds coming to the Ancient One, the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And the Son of Man was given by the Ancient of Days, by God, dominion and glory and kingship, so that all nations, all people, and all languages should serve him. And that the dominion that was given by God to the Son of Man on the clouds would be an everlasting dominion, one that will never pass away, and a kingship that will never be destroyed. So again, the response to Daniel's vision, or the response to Daniel's question of how is God going to save his people from these political kingdoms, these beasts that are devouring the holy ones, the answer is the judgment books are going to open, and God is going to send the Son of Man on the clouds and give the Son of Man all the power, glory, dominion, and everlasting kingship that he needs to displace the kingdoms of this earth and to establish God's reign and God's power on the earth in their stead. Daniel concludes this by expanding upon the idea of the everlasting kingship and dominion that the Son of Man on the clouds will have. Here we are in verse 18. But the holy ones of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Verse 22, and the Ancient One came, and then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High. And the time arrived when the holy ones, those who had been persecuted by those beasts, gained possession of the kingdom because of the intervening work of the Son of Man on the clouds. And the kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. So what a fascinating vision that we have. You can see why scholars refer to this as an apocalyptic vision, a highly symbolic vision that seems to be connecting current political difficulties on the earth with God's ultimate intervention for his people. And this title, Son of Man, is the key link between how God will save his people and what happens on the earth. So how then do we interpret this phrase, Son of Man? Who is this Son of Man on the clouds, and how should we read that phrase when we are looking at Daniel chapter 7? Well, as with all apocalyptic literature that is so highly symbolic, there are actually various ways in which people can read it and have read it in the past. So if you read some commentaries or go online to ask who is the Son of Man from Daniel 7, what you'll find are a few different intriguing options. Option number one is that maybe Daniel is just retaining that Hebrew idiom that we talked about before, that the Son of Man is simply a human being, in which case it's just simply a symbolic counterpoint to the four beasts. If the four beasts represent the evil kingdoms of this world who persecute God's people, the one like a Son of Man, or just the human figure, simply represents God's counterpoint to the earthly kingdoms. So it's very possible that Daniel just had a human figure in mind that is meant to counteract the beasts. Other scholars, however, wonder if instead that this is some kind of angelic deliverance figure, especially in the larger context of the book of Daniel, where we will see angelic deliverers in subsequent chapters. Could this be the first angelic deliverer figure that Daniel is presenting in his series of visions? That's very possible. Also, another third intriguing interpretation is that the Son of Man simply represents the community of Israel as a whole. Like he's representing the people of God, which we can see in those later verses as the Son of Man is given kingship and power and dominion and offers deliverance. So the people of God receive that kingdom and receive that power and receive that deliverance. In which case, maybe this is just a placeholder for the people of God more broadly. Well, the reality is all of these interpretations are fascinating. They're all actually very possible, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. But what I want to focus on here is however Daniel's text originally intended that phrase, Son of Man, to read. I want to focus on what happens after Daniel starts circulating as a text, because it does not take too long, once Daniel is written and starts circulating within the Jewish community, that this phrase, Son of Man, from Daniel 7, takes upon itself messianic connotations. So you can probably easily imagine that if you are one of those groups within early Judaism who feels like the current political climate is oppressive or persecuting or somehow antithetical to life within the kingdom of God, you can probably imagine that those Jewish groups who are looking forward to some kind of messianic redemption or some kind of messianic salvation they're probably going to start asking, well, when is God going to send that figure? When is that Son of Man from the clouds going to descend? And what is that going to look like? So you can probably imagine that whatever Daniel originally intended, that phrase, Son of Man, will quickly take upon itself some significant messianic connotations among several groups. In fact, even among some groups, apparently even becoming a title for the Messiah or a title for the type of deliverance that the Messiah will bring. And so the idea that we look for the heavens because the Son of Man is one day going to come on the clouds to save us from our moment of persecution, deliver the righteous, judge the wicked, and usher in the everlasting kingdom of God becomes a pretty powerful idea among those Jewish groups who are looking forward to some kind of future redemption or future salvation. Let me give you a few examples of texts that are circulating around the time of Jesus that use that phrase, Son of Man, in that exact way. Probably the most prominent is a text that we now call 1st Enoch. This is a text that claims to be written by the Old Testament prophet Enoch. Historically speaking, of course, there's no clear evidence that Enoch produced this text, but by the time of Jesus, various Jewish groups assumed that Enoch had something to do with this text, or at the very least, it reflected a larger Enoch tradition that was circulating in the Jewish community. Well, in 1st Enoch, chapters 37 through 71, a section of the book of 1st Enoch that scholars often call the parables of Enoch, we get several passages that directly use this phrase from Daniel 7, the Son of Man, in reference to the messianic deliverer figure that this particular community that's producing this text is looking forward to. I'll just read a few quick examples just to give you a sense of how this phrase Son of Man can be read messianically in light of Daniel 7. Here's one from 1st Enoch chapter 46, verses 1 through 3, where Enoch, ostensibly, saw one who had a head of days. So kind of like Daniel, Enoch here is seeing God on his throne as the Ancient of Days. And his head, like in Daniel 7, was white like wool. And with him was another being whose countenance had the appearance of a man, just like the Son of Man next to the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. And his face was full of graciousness. The Son of Man was like one of the holy angels. And I asked the angel that was with me to tell me more about that Son of Man, that angelic figure next to God, the Ancient of Days on the throne. Who was he and where did he come from and why is he associated with the Ancient of Days? And the angel said to me, this is the Son of Man who had righteousness, with whom dwells righteousness, and who reveals all of the treasures that were hidden. Okay, so kind of this messianic angelic figure. And 1st Enoch 46 goes on to talk about how this Son of Man who you've seen will raise up the kings and the mighty from their seats, the strong ones from their thrones, and will loosen the reins of the strong, will break the teeth of the sinners. And it goes on to talk about how that Son of Man figure will cast away the darkness that is currently on the earth and will establish God's kingdom, very much like the Son of Man from Daniel 7. Similarly, 1st Enoch chapter 48, as I'm just kind of giving a quick survey of these passages, we read that at that hour, the Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of spirits. So we're seeing that this particular text of 1st Enoch is expanding upon the Son of Man imagery from Daniel 7. In this case, the expansion includes an identification of the Son of Man as coming from a pre-mortal existence. So even before the world was created, the Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his name was before the head, or the Ancient of Days. It goes on, he will be a staff to the righteous who will lean on it and will not fall. He will be a light to the Gentiles. So we're adding all sorts of interesting language to the messianic image of Son of Man from Daniel 7. And he will be the hope of those who have a troubled heart. So if life is difficult, if the kingdoms of this earth seem to be persecuting the holy ones, hang on and have hope, because that Son of Man will symbolize that deliverance and salvation that God will offer. One final passage just to round off our survey. This is 1 Enoch chapter 62. And the Lord of Spirits seated him on the throne of his glory. So again, the Son of Man will have the kingship and usher in the kingship of God on the earth. The spirit of righteousness was poured out upon him, and all the kings and the mighty will see and recognize how he sits on the throne of his glory, and the righteousness is judged before him. So it's not only kingship, but it's judgment scenes and deliverance. When they see that Son of Man sitting on the throne of his glory, the kings and the mighty and all who possess the earth will bless and glorify and extol those who rule. For those from the beginning, the Son of Man was hidden, and the Most High preserved him in the presence of his might and will reveal him to the elect. So that's just a very short survey of one key text, 1 Enoch, that draws upon this Son of Man imagery from Daniel 7, takes the idea of the Son of Man on the clouds being a messianic delivering image of some kind, expands on it in all sorts of ways that reflects the hopes of the community that produced this text, which is around the time of Jesus. And thus we can see one really critical text and Jewish social circle that very much uses this phrase, Son of Man, as a messianic title, drawing it directly from Daniel 7. So that was just one text. There are several that we could survey for the sake of time and concision. I'll just note that these texts survive. You can look through the Dead Sea Scrolls and see additional instances where the Son of Man imagery from Daniel 7 affects the way that a community sees messianic salvation. Another text is 4th Ezra, sometimes referred to as 2nd Esdras. You can find that in any edition of the Apocrypha. And it also uses this phrase, Son of Man on the clouds, as a symbol of redemption. So this now is all background that brings us to the main topic today, which is Jesus. Why was it that Jesus used this title, Son of Man, so often in the Gospels? As we mentioned earlier, over 69 times in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, does Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man. And in the Gospel of John, over 13 times, he refers to himself as the Son of Man. So as a New Testament reader, what are we to make of Jesus' use of that title? By far the title Jesus uses more than any other to refer to himself. Well, I think there are a couple options, and it's almost like you also have to go through by a case-by-case study as you're reading the New Testament Gospels. I think that Jesus does seem to draw upon a variety of possibilities. For example, there are moments in the Gospels when Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man seemingly in the way that most Old Testament texts did, just simply to refer to as a human being, or as a mortal of some kind. Sometimes it does seem like he even refers to the phrase uses the phrase Son of Man as just a kind of a personal pronoun, I, right? I will do this. The Son of Man will do this, right? So we do get a variation of options for what Jesus means when he uses the phrase Son of Man. But for the purpose of this course, I want to take a look at those instances in which Jesus clearly seems to be drawing upon the messianic imagery of that title from Daniel 7. So in the next few minutes, I want to survey a few key New Testament texts where Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man in a way that evokes the kingship imagery, the Son of Man on the cloud imagery, the judgment, the deliverance, all of those symbols that came from Daniel 7 that Jesus now seems to read into that phrase Son of Man as he refers it to himself. Well, the first text that I want to look at is one that might not be overly obvious, but that I think is a critical turning point in the way that Jesus uses this phrase Son of Man as a self-reference. And this is going to be the passage in Matthew 16 and 17 that describes the transfiguration of Jesus. Now, this episode of the transfiguration of Jesus is one that is a bit enigmatic, as modern readers of the New Testament Gospels try to read the story and make sense of the story, it's hard to know exactly what's going on. And as a result, we don't see this story discussed very often. We don't see it often depicted in art, although sometimes it is. And we very rarely see it depicted in film. But nevertheless, I think a close reading of this story of Jesus's transfiguration in Matthew 16 and 17 show very nicely how Jesus uses this phrase "Son of Man" and sees himself in the role of that messianic deliverer from Daniel 7. So let's take a quick look at Matthew 16 and 17, reading this as seeing the transfiguration itself as a revelation to the disciples, to the readers, of Jesus being Daniel's Son of Man. So let's go ahead and start by looking at Matthew 16. The context for this episode is that Jesus and the disciples take some time from the Galilean ministry and they go up north to Caesarea Philippi, right at the base of Mount Hermon, which is a snow-covered mountain most of the year round. From that time, Jesus had a conversation with his disciples. You might remember the discussion in Matthew 16. The disciples are gathered around. Jesus asked them, well, who do people say that I am? Who are you hearing out there in terms of people describing who they think I am? And some of the answers, I've heard that you are, John the Baptist come back to life, or that you're Elijah or one of the prophets come back to life. And then finally, Jesus turns to the disciples and says, well, who do you think that I am? And that's when Peter, of course, famously says, well, I think that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. To which Jesus replies, you are correct, Peter. The Father has revealed that to you. And now we pick up the story. And from that time on, from that moment of Peter's confession that he believes Jesus is the Messiah, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples what that meant, that he had to go to Jerusalem and suffer and die, and on the third day be raised. So for the first time, he's now going into the substance of his messianic ministry for the disciples. And he concludes that description of his messianic ministry by alluding directly to Daniel chapter 7. For the Son of Man will come with the angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. So very clearly drawing upon that image of Son of Man on the clouds, sent by God to deliver the community and open the judgment scene. Jesus uses that to conclude his description of his messianic identity. And then he says in verse 28 of Matthew 16, truly I'm telling you that there are some of you 12, at least a few of you 12, standing right here, who will not die until you see the Son of Man in his glory and in his kingdom. Probably not a coincidence that the very next chapter, right? Remember, there is no modern chapter divisions in the ancient text. So an ancient reader is going to pick up right there and say that some of you are not going to die until you see the Son of Man coming in glory. The very next verse, in chapter 17, verse 1, 6 days later, Jesus took some of them, Peter, James, and John, some of the 12, and went to an exceedingly high mountain, probably Mount Hermon, which is right next to the site of Caesarea Philippi. And as they are up on that high mountain by themselves, Jesus was transformed in front of them. It's a great word in Greek, because the word in Greek actually has to do with morphing. It's like he morphs, like he changes shape. He's transfigured before them. And in that transfiguration, the human-looking Jesus with the street clothes that he had from the Galilean villages, probably covered in the dust of the roads, all melt away. And as he is transformed or transfigured in front of them, his face began to shine like the sun. His clothes became bright like lightning. And suddenly, there's an entire theophany. It's not only the bright, sun-shining Jesus, right? But now it's Moses and Elijah, these Old Testament prophets who are now with him talking. And with this, Peter, James, and John just become overwhelmed with this theophany or this divine appearance that they seem to experience. In fact, Peter even says, Lord, it is really good for us to be here. Should we set up some tabernacles, some kind of portable temples of some kind to house the divine beings that seem to be in front of us? And with that, the scene just rolls on. And while Peter was speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, and a voice came from the clouds saying, "This is my son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now, in that phrase that the divine voice speaks out of the clouds, it's actually a conflation of several Old Testament verses, one of which is Psalm 2, today you are my son, or you are my son, today I've begotten you. A beautiful psalm that was sung at the coronation of Israelite kings. So at least part of the message of the heavenly voice coming from the cloud that is now surrounding Jesus is that Jesus is declared to have the kingship that God is bestowing upon him, along with some other things that other verses in that passage seem to allude to. So here we have Jesus, who's now glowing with his face like the sun. His garments are white like lightning. He's surrounded by a cloud, and the heavenly voice just declared that he is endowed with heavenly kingship from Psalm 2. And when the disciples heard this, of course, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them and saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." And when the disciples lifted up their eyes, the whole thing was done. Jesus was back in his street clothes with the smudges of Galilean dirt on him, perhaps. Moses and Elijah were gone. The cloud was gone. No more heavenly voices. No more shining like the sun or lightning. And you can imagine the disciples saying, "What was that? Right? What did we just see? What are we experiencing here? What are we to take away from all of this?" Well, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus ordered those 3 disciples, "Do not tell anybody about the vision that you've just seen until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Well, with the disciples, we are left to ask, what was that? I mean, what is it with this scene? What a fascinating scene. So much to unpack here, so many different ways that we could explore this particular passage. For example, many biblical scholars will notice that there's a lot of imagery with the Mount of Transfiguration that seems to be drawn from Exodus 34. Right, where Moses is on Mount Sinai, where Moses communes with God and he begins to shine and so forth. So is it possible that with the Mount of Transfiguration, the gospel authors are trying to suggest that Jesus is a new Moses of some kind? That's very possible. That's a really interesting option. In Latter-day Saint circles, many Latter-day Saint scholars and readers of the Bible have noticed a really strong parallel between the Transfiguration episode of Matthew 16 and 17 and what happens with the Kirtland Temple dedication, right? We have Jesus, Elijah, Moses all appearing in kind of a temple scene. And so that has led to some unique Latter-day Saint perspectives on perhaps some kind of temple endowment is happening here in some way. And I think that's a fascinating interpretation too. These are not mutually exclusive. I think several of these possible options can inform the way we read the text. But for our purposes today, I want to suggest that one of the additional ways we can read this text is that we can see the transfiguration of Jesus as described here in Matthew 17 as a revelation to the disciples and to the reader that Jesus is in fact the Son of Man from Daniel 7. Right? We have all those elements that are there. It's the Son of Man with the clouds, the kingship, and it's almost like we're getting a little glimpse into who Jesus, the Galilean street preacher, really is. He is, in fact, that messianic deliverance figure that will save God's people from the devouring political entities of this earth. So I think that's a really powerful way to look at this text. And I think that there's, going forward, some additional support for that. Because after this episode, Jesus will now increasingly refer to himself as Son of Man. And as he does, he will increasingly add images of kingship and judgment and deliverance, seemingly connecting himself with Daniel's Son of Man. Now, before we move on, though, I do want to point out really quickly that if you've looked carefully at this passage, from Matthew 17, you may have noticed that there is indeed a lot of powerful Son of Man imagery, but there's also some fascinating Ancient of Days imagery, right? The idea of Jesus' face shining like the sun and his garments white like lightning. Those are all images that Daniel 7 attributed to the Ancient of Days on his throne. So it does seem that there's a bit of a conflation here. We have a lot of Ancient of Days images combined with some Son of Man images, all wrapped up in the person of Jesus at the Transfiguration, kind of reminding us of that Greek manuscript tradition of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man perhaps even being linked in some powerful way. I think that's a fascinating possible observation. It's also interesting to note that later Christians, including the author of the book of Revelation, similarly describe Jesus as Daniel's Son of Man, along with images from the Ancient of Days. So for example, Revelation chapter 1, this is John the Revelator seeing a vision of Jesus as Son of Man and Ancient of Days. Then I turned to see whose voice was speaking to me, and I saw 7 golden lampstands. It's like he's looking into the heavenly temple of some kind. And in the midst of those 7 golden lampstands, I saw one like the Son of Man. from Daniel 7, clothed with a long robe, a golden sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white as white wool, white as snow, and his eyes were like a flaming fire. And it goes on to talk about his face shone like the sun, shining with full force. So very much like Matthew 17, Revelation 1 also combines images of Ancient of Days and Son of Man into the person of Jesus. It almost suggests that there might have been some early Christian tradition of the close connection between the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. But what they both have in common is that these two authors see those images in the person of Jesus. And so with that first passage then, with that first glimpse of the transfiguration as a revelation of Jesus as Daniel's Son of Man, now let's move forward in the gospel tradition, staying with the synoptic gospels. We'll stay with Matthew for now, and we'll look at additional passages where Jesus refers to himself using that seemingly messianic title. The next one I'll look at in our brief survey is going to be Matthew chapter 19, verses 28 through 30. This is a moment where Jesus is talking with the disciples, and Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, in that era where all things are made new, when the Son of Man is seated on the throne of his glory," clear reference to Daniel 7, "you who have followed me," meaning you 12 disciples, "will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the tribes of Israel." So a really fascinating chapter, only one chapter after the transfiguration, that Jesus says that when the renewal of all things happen, then the Son of Man comes in the clouds of glory, those of you who have followed me will participate in that judgment scene that goes all the way back to Daniel 7. That's a fascinating chapter. The next set of chapters is going to be Matthew 24 through 25. So we're just kind of marching through now the Jesus story, getting closer and closer to the end of his life and his resurrection. And in Matthew 24 and 25, we are given the final discourse that Jesus gives to his disciples as they're sitting on the Mount of Olives overlooking the Jerusalem Temple Mount. And the sermon, which goes for those two chapters, Matthew 24 and 25, begin with the disciples asking basically two questions. Will you tell us when the temple will be destroyed? Because Jesus had just previously said the Jerusalem temple would be destroyed. So the disciples ask first, will you tell us, when will that be? I mean, tell us more about that. And then second, will you also tell us about your coming at the end of the age? So it seems like these two questions of when will the Jerusalem temple be destroyed, like you had just predicted, and tell us more about your second coming, are two questions that seem very related to these disciples. They're just looking forward to what does the future bring for God's kingdom and for your role in God's kingdom. And in response, Jesus gives this marvelous discourse. Sometimes it's called the apocalyptic discourse because, like Daniel, Jesus gives a lot of imagery to describe the kingdoms of this world, but then also how God will save his people from the kingdoms of this world. And he begins this apocalyptic discourse by describing the first question. He begins by telling the disciples about what things will be like when the Jerusalem temple will be destroyed, which will only be about 40 years from the time Jesus is giving this sermon on the Mount of Olives. He describes the destruction of Jerusalem. He describes the destruction of the temple, events that he thinks will lead up to that. And those are all things, by the way, which we can see from the Jewish historian Josephus did in fact occur in the years leading up to AD 70 when the Romans destroyed the temple of Herod in Jerusalem. But the rest of the sermon then goes on to address the disciples' second question, which is, now tell us about your coming at the end of the age. That's their way of saying what we might describe as, tell us about your second coming. Well, to describe the second coming, or his coming at the end of the age, Jesus, unsurprisingly, refers to Daniel 7, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory. It's almost like that Daniel 7 passage was such a key framework for Jesus to understand the second coming and what that end time scenario would be like. So here he is, Matthew 24, verses 27 through 29, paraphrasing the Son of Man imagery from Daniel 7. Well, Jesus says it's just going to be like a lightning bolt that shoots across the sky from the east to the west. It's going to be quick, it's going to be bright, and that is what it's going to be like with the coming of the Son of Man. Immediately after that moment, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give his light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. So again, a lot of very symbolic apocalyptic imagery here of how all things are going to be made new when the Son of Man comes like a lightning bolt across the sky. He goes on to say, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, because now that's that great judgment day that Daniel 7 said would happen when the beasts fell and the Son of Man came. Well, Jesus says, and they will see, quote, now he's just directly quoting Daniel 7, quote, the Son of Man will come on the clouds of glory, or the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather the elect of God's people from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. So kind of like the Enoch text we looked at, here we are taking the Son of Man concept from Daniel 7, expanding on it a bit, and Jesus is using that as the primary framework for describing his own coming at the end of the age, at the renewal of all things. Well, he goes on to say that, by the way, about that day and hour, no one will know. The angels don't know. He even says the Son doesn't know. Says, I don't even know when that'll be. Only the Father knows, Jesus says. But I will say this. It'll be like it was in the days of Noah, right? Where that's how it's going to be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. That's how it's going to be at the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus seems here to be saying that it is just going to be a normal day. I mean, there's nothing inherently bad or evil or debaucherous about eating and drinking and getting married. This is all his way, seemingly, to say it's just going to be another day. You're going to be living your life that day, and all of a sudden, that lightning bolt in an unexpected hour is going to come cracking across the sky, and there is the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven in power and great glory. So it'll be just like that. So therefore, because we do not know the day or the hour of the coming of the Son of Man, that unexpected day, therefore watch and be ready, for the Son of Man, Daniel 7, is coming at an unexpected hour, or an hour that you think not. And then he goes on, the rest of the sermon are parables of preparation. At that day, the coming of the Son of Man, it'll be like the parable of the 10 virgins, or it'll be like the parable of the 10 talents, or it'll be like the parable of the sheep and the goats. At that unexpected day, when the Son of Man comes out of the clouds, be caught prepared. Like the parable of the virgins, be caught with that spirit in your life. Or like the parable of the talents, at that unexpected day, be caught consecrating to the master. Or like in the third sheep and the goats image, when that unexpected day comes of the coming of the Son of Man in glory, those who are caught clothing the naked and feeding the sick and visiting the imprisoned, they will be the sheep that are exalted on the right hand at that unexpected coming of the Son of Man day. So that was the final discourse that Jesus gives, at least in the synoptic gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And it's a powerful reminder that Jesus did see himself in that framing of Daniel 7, Son of Man, the Messianic deliverer figure, coming on the clouds of glory to save his people. Now, there are 2 or 3 more passages. I'll mention these very briefly, just to kind of round out our survey here. The next passage is the Son of Man on trial. This image comes up again one more time with Jesus on trial before the Jewish authorities of Jerusalem the night before his crucifixion. Just to summarize this story, you might remember that as the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem are trying to find a way to convict Jesus, some kind of legal grounds on which they can condemn him. Ultimately, the high priest says, why aren't you saying anything? Tell us plainly. I'm putting you under oath by the true and living God to tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of God, or not? And this is a pretty critical moment for Jesus, because he is now being told under oath to tell, who are you? And his response, by now you probably shouldn't be surprised, his response is, to quote Daniel 7, you have said so, but I tell you that from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven, all directly from Daniel 7. And then at that moment, the high priest tore his clothes and said, that's it, he's blasphemed. We can get him on blasphemy. He thinks he's the Son of Man from Daniel 7. That's enough to go on, right? And all the witnesses say, yeah, I think that's probably enough. And so it is interesting to note that in the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that ultimately the reason why the Jewish leadership of Jerusalem, the grounds on which they find to condemn him, actually is blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of Man from Daniel 7. A fascinating example, especially when you read it a little more closely, and it almost seems like what he's saying, from here on out, or from now on, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory. It's almost like he's saying that the Son of Man, Jesus, through his crucifixion, is getting ready to appear to the Ancient of Days, at which time he will be endowed with all the kingship, dominion, power, and glory to save his people and to redeem them from the entities of this earth. Which, by the way, that is the conclusion of the Gospels, at least according to the Gospel of Matthew, is that after Jesus is crucified and goes back to the Father, he is resurrected. And the last scene that Matthew tells us is in Matthew 28, is a scene where Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, takes his disciples up to Galilee. And they stand on a high mountain, and Jesus, as now the newly exalted Christ, gives the what's called the Great Commission to the disciples, where he says to the 11 disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth has now been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And don't forget, I will always be with you even until the end of the age. The fascinating thing about that Great Commission is it starts by quoting Daniel 7. All authority in heaven and on earth has now been given to me, the resurrected Jesus says, quoting the very line of power and authority that was given to the Son of Man by the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7, so that the Son of Man could save the righteous, judge the wicked, and initiate God's kingdom on the earth. Here, the resurrected Jesus is again presenting himself in that role. Finally, I know we're running out of time, so I'll just conclude by indicating that Jesus' life and ministry and teachings does not put an end to identifying Jesus with Son of Man. In fact, well after the time of Jesus, into the earliest generations of Christianity, that tradition continues, where we see in later New Testament texts other authors identifying Jesus as the Son of Man. One fascinating example is in the book of Acts, right? Acts chapter 7. You might remember the story of Stephen, the first martyr within the Christian community. And you might remember the story of Acts 7, that as Stephen was being stoned to death, as he was being martyred outside of the city of Jerusalem, he was filled with the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven, saw the glory of God, the Ancient of Days on the throne, and he saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And then he said, look, I see the heavens open, and I see the Son of Man, the exalted Jesus, standing at the right hand of God, just like Daniel's Son of Man stood near the throne of the Ancient of Days. And with that, they covered their ears with a loud shout, rushed together against him. They dragged him out of the city and began to stone him to death. So our first Christian martyr, Stephen, ultimately dies, again for blasphemy, because he associates Jesus with Daniel's messianic figure, the Son of Man. One final example is going to be Revelation 14. We've already seen in Revelation chapter 1, the opening vision of the book of Revelation, how John the Revelator sees a vision of Jesus in the heavens, identified as the Son of Man with some Ancient of Days imagery conflated in there. And that vision continues. In Revelation chapter 14, we again describe Jesus. There was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, and he had a golden crown on his head. There's that kingship. And with that golden crown, with that power of kingship and dominion, he comes to the earth and saves God's people and judges the wicked. So that brings us to the end of our survey. I hope that this has been a helpful conversation as we try to understand, why did Jesus use that title, Son of Man, so often, more often, in fact, than any other title. And I hope that this survey has helped us to see at least one way in which we can make sense of that title. To be sure, the phrase Son of Man in Hebrew, as a Hebrew or even Aramaic idiom, could often mean simply a human being, and it often is used that way in Scripture, often in the Old Testament and even sometimes in the New Testament. However, with that critical transition of Daniel chapter 7, that apocalyptic vision where we see the Son of Man on the clouds as a messianic deliverance figure, that image or that title can now easily reflect the messianic hopes of so many within the Jewish community as they are looking for that cluster of images, the authority, the kingship, the judgment, the exaltation, the second coming, the deliverance that will all come with that Son of Man on the clouds. As those messianic groups, or those groups with messianic hopes, are looking forward to that end times, those final days of God's deliverance where all things will be made new and God's kingdom will come in on the earth, I hope we can now see that title becomes a powerful way for Jesus to describe his own messianic imagery, and a powerful way for us as disciples to view Jesus' work as Messiah.